Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into the life of one of England's most overlooked monarchs, King Henry III. You might have heard of his famous father, the notorious King John, or his powerhouse son, Edward I, aka Longshanks. But what about Henry himself? His reign was one of the longest in English history, spanning a whopping 56 years. So, why does he often get lost in the shuffle? Well, his time on the throne was a roller coaster of rebellion, artistic passion, and a fundamental struggle for power that would change England forever. So grab a snack, get comfortable, and let's uncover the story of the king who was more of a builder than a warrior, more of a saint than a strategist, and whose legacy is literally carved into the stones of England's most famous buildings. Henry's story begins in chaos. He was just 9 years old in 1216 when his father, King John, died. England was in the middle of a brutal civil war, known as the First Barons' War. The barons, fed up with John's disastrous rule and high taxes, had not only forced him to sign the Magna Carta, but had also invited Prince Louis of France to invade and take the English crown. For a moment, it looked like the Plantagenet dynasty was over. But John's death surprisingly changed everything. Suddenly, the problem wasn't the tyrannical King John anymore. It was the prospect of a French king on the English throne. The loyalist barons, led by the legendary knight William Marshal, saw an opportunity. They rallied around the young Henry, crowning him king in a hasty ceremony at Gloucester Cathedral. He was uncrowned with the official crown that had been lost in a marsh, but with a simple gold circlet belonging to his mother. It was a shaky start for a boy king in a divided kingdom. For the first decade of his reign, Henry was king in name only. The real power lay with his regents, first the wise and respected William Marshal, and then Hubert de Burgh. They fought tirelessly to drive out the French and bring the rebellious barons back into the fold. Marshal, even in his 70s, was a force of nature. He won the decisive Battle of Lincoln in 1217, a victory that essentially saved the kingdom for Henry. The regents also reissued the Magna Carta, showing the barons that the new regime would respect their rights and the rule of law. This was a brilliant political move. It transformed the charter from a rebel document into the foundation of English governance. During these early years, young Henry was learning, watching, and absorbing the complex political landscape around him. He was also developing a deep personal piety that would define his entire life and reign. When Henry finally took full control of the government in 1227, he had a very different idea of kingship than his father. Where John was aggressive and pragmatic, Henry was idealistic and deeply influenced by his European relatives. He dreamed of restoring the vast Angevin Empire his grandfather, Henry II, had ruled, which included huge territories in France. This ambition would prove to be one of his greatest weaknesses. His early military campaigns in France were expensive and largely unsuccessful, draining the royal treasury and frustrating the English barons who had to foot the bill. They saw these foreign wars as a waste of English money and lives, fought for the king's personal glory rather than the good of the realm. This growing discontent over foreign policy and taxation set the stage for major conflicts to come. Adding to the tension was Henry's personal life. In 1236, he married Eleanor of Provence. By all accounts, it was a loving and devoted marriage that produced 5 children, including the future Edward I. However, Eleanor arrived in England with a large entourage of her relatives from Savoy, known as the Savoy. Henry, ever generous to those he favored, showered them with titles, lands, and powerful positions in government. A few years later, Henry's own half-siblings, the Lusignans, arrived from France and received similar treatment. To the English barons, this was infuriating. They felt that these foreign favorites were displacing them from their rightful places as the king's advisors and were gobbling up England's wealth. It created a perception that Henry trusted foreigners more than his own people, a charge that would haunt him for his entire reign and fueled the flames of rebellion. But Henry wasn't just a struggling politician. He was one of England's greatest ever artistic patrons. His deep religious faith inspired a massive building program centered on honoring England's national saint Edward the Confessor. Henry saw himself as Edward's heir, not just in title, but in spirit. He decided to completely rebuild Westminster Abbey in the latest, most glorious French Gothic style. He poured a fortune into Eton, amount equivalent to tens of billions of dollars today. He wanted it to be a masterpiece, a testament to his piety and the glory of God. The abbey became his life's passion. He oversaw every detail, from the soaring vaulted ceilings and intricate carvings to the stunning cosmete pavement at the high altar. Westminster Abbey, as we know it today, is largely Henry's creation. He also invested heavily in castles like the Tower of London and Windsor Castle, transforming them from grim military fortresses into comfortable, lavish royal palaces. By the 1250s, the political situation had reached a boiling point. A combination of failed military campaigns, the immense cost of his building projects, and a disastrous plan to buy the crown of Sicily for his younger son Edmund had left Henry bankrupt. He was forced to go to the barons cap in hand to ask for more taxes. This time, they'd had enough. Led by Henry's own brother-in-law, the formidable Simon de Montfort, a group of powerful barons confronted the king in 1258. They forced him to agree to a radical set of reforms known as the Provisions of Oxford. This document effectively stripped the king of his absolute power and placed him under the control of a council of 15 barons. For the first time, the king was not above the law. He was subject to it. This was a revolutionary moment in English history, a massive step towards a constitutional monarchy. Henry, of course, hated this arrangement. He was a king who believed in the divine right to rule, and he spent the next few years trying to wriggle out of the provisions. This power struggle between Henry and Simon de Montfort eventually exploded into open warfare, the Second Barons' War. In 1264, at the Battle of Lewes, de Montfort's army crushed the royalist forces and captured both King Henry and his son, Prince Edward. For the next year, Simon de Montfort was the de facto ruler of England, and in a move that would echo through the centuries, de Montfort summoned a parliament in 1265. What made this one so special was that, for the first time, he included not just the barons and the clergy, but also representatives from the towns and shires, the commoners. This is often seen as the very first English parliament, the direct ancestor of the House of Commons we have today. It was a radical idea born out of political necessity, but its impact was monumental. De Montfort's rule, however, was short-lived. His arrogance and ambition alienated many of his fellow barons. Meanwhile, Prince Edward, a far more capable and ruthless leader than his father, managed to escape from captivity. He rallied the royalist forces and confronted de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. The battle was a brutal and decisive victory for the royalists. Simon de Montfort was killed, and his body was horrifically mutilated on the battlefield. King Henry was restored to the throne, his authority seemingly absolute once more. But something had fundamentally changed. The ideas of reform, of limited monarchy, and of parliamentary representation couldn't just be uninvented. Prince Edward, having seen his father's failures up close, understood this. He knew that the crown needed to work with the barons and the wider realm, not just rule over them by divine will. In the final years of his reign, Henry faded into the background as his son Edward increasingly took charge. The kingdom was pacified and a degree of stability returned. Henry was able to focus on what he loved most, his family and the completion of his beloved Westminster Abbey. In 1269, he presided over a magnificent ceremony to move the body of Edward the Confessor into its glorious new shrine at the heart of the abbey. It was the culmination of his life's work. 3 years later, in 1272, Henry III died at the age of 65. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, right next to the saint he had revered his whole life, in the very church he had rebuilt. It was a fitting final resting place. His son, who was away on crusade, returned to become King Edward I, one of England's most famous and formidable warrior kings. So, what is Henry III's legacy? It's complicated. Politically, his reign can be seen as a failure. He lost foreign wars, alienated his barons, and was even captured and deposed for a time. He was not a strong leader in the traditional military sense, but his supposed weaknesses also led to incredible strengths. His financial desperation and political crises forced the development of Parliament, laying the groundwork for English democracy. His piety and love of art gave us some of England's greatest architectural treasures. Most notably, Westminster Abbey. He was a king who preferred the chisel to the sword, the stained glass window to the battlefield. While his contemporaries might have seen him as weak, his 56-year reign was a pivotal era that shaped England's art, architecture, and, most importantly, its political future. He might not have been the king his barons wanted, but perhaps he was the king that England needed. Thanks so much for watching. What do you think of Henry III? Was he a failed king or an unsung hero? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into medieval history, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. We'll see you in the next one.